Okay. So, how are we getting on? Where were we, so to speak? What have we done so far? We're going to try and get some more lights on. So the course is supposed to be about economic growth and sustainable development, isn't it? And what was the big picture we talked about? We had these phases, didn't we? Let's just remind ourselves what they were and where we are in the big picture then. So what was the first phase? Going back until about 1700. That was the Malthusian, wasn't it? And then in that phase, we've got technological progress, and we use that, the sort of fruits of that we use to increase our population rather than to increase our wealth per person, right? And what happens to the environment during that phase, or the environment, natural resources, biodiversity? Is it a sort of paradise of man in harmony with nature, so to speak, or humans in harmony with nature? No. Of course, this whole concept of humans and nature is kind of tricky, isn't it? Especially when you go back that far. It's like we're part of nature. Even today, we're also natural from a sort of natural science perspective. But we were busy sort of wiping out species and so on, and causing massive changes to ecosystems, even 50,000 years ago, when we arrived in North America, for instance. You can see not just a few species disappearing, but this is then having knock-on effects on how the ecosystems are working and so on. We didn't really talk much about that. What about the sort of sustainability aspect from a human perspective? So this is the kind of picture summing up some of the more pessimistic ideas about sustainability, right? What do we say about that in this analysis? It just happens to be. So think about the model with the big, what was it, the megafauna. So, typically in our models, and when we're thinking about this, we're not sort of just doing this for fun, are we? Can anyone, what? There were some quite clear conclusions from the modelling here about sort of we're sort of busy, maybe this guy's cutting firewood, and then could we end up cutting so much firewood, so to speak, that there'll be no more, suddenly we've got no firewood left and we'll die.
Probably not, because we would decrease the population.
Right, so that's the kind of basic idea, isn't it? That if we're really dependent on something and then we're harvesting it, then probably if the numbers of that thing go down, then probably our population will go down, and then hopefully the other thing can recover. But of course, there might be reasons why that wouldn't work, right? Like if there's a minimum viable population, and if we could potentially push the population below that before our population falls, and then the other one never recovers, and we're gone, we're done for. And then another alternative is, I guess we just give up with the lights. Maybe it's whatever. There's another alternative, which is that if there's something else that we can rely on, then we might push the small animal megafauna case, right? If we're not actually dependent on the megafauna, then we might push them to extinction. Then it's easy to see how we could push them to extinction. What about like climate change? Does that kind of stuff have anything to teach us about climate change, or the probability that we're going to cause do this basically today?
I suppose we're dependent on the climate as well, so we wouldn't push it to the very edge, according to the Malthusian.
Yeah. I guess the thing is, so there's sort of similarities and differences, aren't there? So in the Malthusian thing, it's our population reacts to the scarcity that we've created. But it's kind of, I mean, wow, if we trigger climate change, which led to our population to sort of go down from 7.5, 8 billion, depending on when it happens, to sort of 2 billion or something. I mean, that's already unbelievably catastrophic, considering it's like totally unnecessary. So in a way, the kind of dips in human population and the dips in the human population we were getting in that model, that would be like totally unacceptable kind of, I mean that would be way beyond anything that could possibly be like worth accepting for the sake of carrying on burning fossil fuels for a while. I guess that's one thing you could say about it. Another thing is this idea of we were talking about, I think it was your idea originally, that if the population goes below some level, then you might set in train something that you can't stop. And of course there's ideas with the climate as well, that maybe we go past some tipping point without knowing it, and then it's too late. So that kind of thing could sort of make a difference. Like your point was, look, we're not that stupid. Why would, we can do without fossil fuels. We're never going to cause like this total, utter catastrophe. Surely we'll sort it out before then. But maybe we'll set in train a series of events that we then can't stop before we realise that we've done it. So those are the kind of arguments that come into play when you're trying to say that, looking at the possibility that things could go really pear-shaped, so to speak, that things could, that we could have a real massive climate disaster that affected the whole human population, kind of.
And then like the climate would recover after some time, because then the human population has declined, or is that?
So of course, in geological time, everything will recover. Like if humans would happen to get wiped out, so like we're wiping out biodiversity now. In geological time, if you project forward another million years or something, who knows? You know, it's not going to be like, oh, there's so little biodiversity now because of what we did a million years earlier. But on the human perspective, of course, it's going to take a long, long time for the climate to recover, like, you know, thousands of years. The carbon dioxide is going to be kicking around. If we don't suck it back out of the atmosphere, it's going to be kicking around for a long time. So on our time scales, it's going to take like forever to recover. But on the time scales of the sort of geological evolutionary processes, it's like, it's kind of a blip, you could say, you could argue. Okay. Just throwing some thoughts around, really. Gonna keep some exercise. I've never taught in this room before, I don't think. Or maybe it's a special lighting in here, I don't know. Okay. And what was the next phase? So that's what we call the consumerist phase, wasn't it? And that's a term that I've made up, so I'll put it in scare quotes. And then in this phase, we're using the power we get from technological progress, we're using it to we're using the power we get from technological progress to increase our consumption of it. And so, at the moment, we're trying to get our heads around what that actually means. And that's what we're actually going to do for most of the course. Just trying to get our heads around this phase and what's been going on and what we can expect in the future. And then we'll spend a little bit of time on the technotopia phase. Okay. And where do we get to in trying to get our heads around this? Oh. Sorry. So we looked at the solo model, didn't we? And in the solo model, there's a big focus on the balance between, so this is Y. What letter do I put here? If this is Y coming out of the factory.
C?
Yeah, and this E-I. Yeah, E, I was about to say. There's a big focus in Solo on this balance. And this means there's only one product in the model, so we can call it a widget, and do you send widgets back to the factory to help make more widgets, or do you send them off to households to be consumed? And there's a big focus on this balance, but what we find is, in the end, that whatever the balance, it doesn't actually make that much difference. Why not? It's basically because of this Cobb-Douglas function. Because the more you send here, the bigger K is going to be, right, in the long run. And you're actually going to end up on, if you've got a fixed proportion here, so if C is 1 minus sy, and I is sy, and everything else is just constant, L and AL, you're going to end up on a balanced growth path with a fixed K. But because alpha is only about 0.3, even if you like double k, you multiply y by 2 to the point 3, which is not much more than 1. Okay. So it doesn't actually help much saving more. And of course, you're sacrificing consumption in the short run to send your widgets over here, and then in the long run, you don't even get much out of it. And it's useless for, like, if you're trying to explain, like, why GDP in the US is 100 times GDP in, like, Somalia or something. This is useless, like, it doesn't do the job. So if we can, why is GDP in the US? Let's not take Somalia because that brings other thoughts into your head about war and so on. I don't really want that. Let's think of a country with, let's just take a relatively thriving country in Africa, like Ghana. Okay, but still, GDP in the US is like maybe 20 times or 30 times GDP in Ghana per head, of course. I'm always talking, when I'm talking about prices, it's always real prices. Generally, when I'm talking about GDP, it's GDP per capita, yeah. So if we want to explain why GDP per capita is, say, 20, 30 times higher, I guess, in the US than in Ghana, and we want to base it on this production function. The Solo model puts the spotlight here. But where do we need to put the spotlight if we want to explain this 30 times difference? AL, yeah. So if we're trying to use this, it's like, okay, so they've got like 1/millionth of the amount of capital per head in Ghana, but then there should be like massive incentives to invest capital in Ghana. Returns to capital should be like sky high. It just doesn't make any sense. Okay. The problem is that labor productivity in Ghana is way lower. Whereas in the Solo model, you assume that everybody has access to the same technology, so the productivities are the same everywhere. But to explain the differences, you need to say, look, productivity isn't the same. Even if, in theory, there's sort of free access to all these different designs for different types of machines and production processes and so on. In practice, it's more complicated than that. Okay. So that's a bit of an aside, really. We don't really have time to delve into that too much. Okay, so where did we actually get to on this? We didn't go through this, did we? Oh, well, yeah. Does anyone remember, like, where did we get to? So I wasn't exactly following the slides, was I? But we worked through this model. I'm sure about that. And now I'm not sure how much we talked about this. But that's just what I've just been talking about here. That if you save more, you're going to build up a bit more capital where you're saving more, but the end result in terms of higher GDP per capita will be dividing by L, right? It's not much. And if there's a global capital market, it's even harder to make any sense of it, because then even if they're saving less in one country, investors should invest here anyway, send their capital, because there'll be higher returns in the country with less capital, but the same AL. Okay. And then there's the video for this one. So I don't think I'm going to go through this. But just briefly then, there's also a version of the Solo model where Solo says, well look, it's still not saying that AL is different in different countries, but it's just saying, let's just assume that AL grows at a constant exogenous rate. And then you can get growth in Y, and you actually get Y dot over Y is G, don't you? If G is the growth rate of AL. So, Solo shows that just by investing in capital you can't get growth. To get long run growth you need growth in productivity, which is what I've sort of been trying to hammer in right from the start. That the driver of growth is productivity growth. Okay. What Solo can do is reasonably well is explain recovery or the effect of shocks to capital. We talked about that. So what drives growth in the Solo model? Productivity growth. What drives growth in real economies? Productivity growth. Okay. And labour productivity is very extremely fundamental. We also have increases in productivity of other inputs like natural resources. But labour productivity growth is really fundamental. Okay. Ramsey, what's Ramsey about? Have any of you studied the Ramsey model? You have? Okay. Ha! You should have. You're in trouble now. So, can you give us an idea about what does Ramsey? Effectively, you can add a Ramsey to the Solo model. Okay, effectively. And then you have like the Ramsey-Cass-Koopmans model or whatever. So what are you doing when you add Ramsey? You remember?
Is it that the savings rate is more or not?
Right. Very good. So in Solo you just say, oh, if people save S, and they'll do that whatever the current situation is. Even if half our capital just got destroyed, they'll still save proportion S. But in Ramsey, consumers are solving, or households are solving a dynamic optimization problem. And depending on their preferences, which means the value of sigma, if suddenly half their capital gets destroyed, they might say, oh, we've got high returns to capital, we've got, so we're going to invest more to build up quickly, even though that means, so if we look at consumption, if we got time here and consumption, and if there's a big shock to capital, if S stays the same, consumption's going to go down, right? And then people might say, oh, we've lost consumption, we really hate uneven consumption, so we're going to reduce our savings to reduce the size of the shock, which will then lead to a slow recovery. Or they might say, wow, consumption's gone down, but we're pretty flexible, we just care about the long run, and there's really high returns to capital investment now, so we're actually going to reduce even more and raise our savings to get quickly back here. And that will, what they choose depends on sigma. So that's kind of what you're doing in Ramsey. But that's just a an aside, okay, it's not really a part of the course, but because we're not going to look at that stuff. Okay. If we're interested in the very long run, what Solo shows basically is that the capital stock ends up tracking GDP. So what have we got here? So it basically means you can kind of leave it out if you're really just interested in the very long run. What we're learning from models like the Solo model is that capital, we don't really need to include it in our analysis. So how do we work that out? I'm kind of looking for a pointer. Can anyone see anything to point with? No. I don't think there's anything, is there? Why don't you have a look at this? Yeah, I'll come round. I'm just talking and talking here. Have a look at this and see if you can get your heads around it. I'll come round and talk to you, okay? What's the top equation there? Did you get it? No?
Divided by AL, right? Like you divided the whole thing with AL.
What's the whole thing? I think you've got it, but...
Like ALL 1 minus alpha divided by AL, and then you simplify H. Maybe not. It's fine.
So the whole... I just wanted you to say the production function, basically. But yeah, it's got something to do with this, hasn't it? But we could write this as ALL, y equals ALL times ALL to the minus alpha times k to the alpha, couldn't we? So then we could write it as y equals ALL times k over ALL all to the alpha, which is that. So that's just another way of writing the production function. Okay. Well, why have I written it like that? Because on balanced growth, we know from the thing I went through on the video when AL was growing, that this and this grow at the same rate. So that's just constant. So we can actually we don't lose much by just writing this if we're interested in the long run. Then we know that if there's shocks to capital, then this isn't going to be quite true in the short run or medium run, but in the long run you'll return to this trend.
I was thinking that maybe would you think like that, like as time goes to infinity, like the k through ALL will, what do you say, asymptotically be 1?
Not 1 actually, but it'll approach some number.
Yeah.
Asymptotically. But of course, as Keynes said, in the long run we're all dead. So you need to be careful to think, oh, well in the long run, if that means in 1,000 years, it's not that interesting. But actually, if you look at the simulation I did, we're talking about 20-year time scales. You've got an so this is the simulation here. You've got an absolutely massive shock to capital here. And 20 years later, you can hardly see the difference. Okay. So then if we're interested in the long run, why not just assume that this is always at its long run level and then just drop it. So what we lose by dropping capital, we lose the ability to model, for instance, the effects of shocks to capital. And of course, in some models, it might be super important to think explicitly about capital. So, if you're looking in detail at electricity generation and thinking about, the transition from fossil to gas, to wind, to solar, whatever, then it would be really important, if we're trying to say stuff in detail about that, it would be essential to include capital in that modeling. Why is that? Think of nuclear as well as in the energy mix. If you're looking at transitions, changes in the energy production system. So it's basically because you've got, in that sector, you've got massive capital investments, which then, they depreciate very slowly. You can basically, once you've invested in the coal-fired power station, you can run it for 50 years. And the same with nuclear. So when did the Swedes build their nuclear power stations? I guess it was late 60s or something, in the 60s anyway. And they're still running. So obviously there's circumstances where it's really important to think carefully about capital. But we're taking much more of a bird's eye view of things in this course, and then typically we don't need to worry too much about capital. Okay. This model's kind of cool, but I'm not going to take you through it, I don't think. Oh God, we got that endogenous growth to do. Yeah, wow. Okay. So I'm going to say a little bit about this model. So, how can we actually think about the growth process if we, despite what I said earlier, want to include capital? So, looking for something to rub out with. Absolutely nothing. Can anyone see anything? Oh, yeah, those things. They look. I didn't recognize what they were. Looks like you can sort of charge them with something. Okay, so I'm just going to take you through this actually, or just sort of tell you the answer kind of for this. So basically, we can think of the growth process a bit like a spiral, where each moving up one loop is like one period. And what we need to do to move up a loop, to get new, more productive technologies going in the economy. If we're at a leading edge economy, we need to do two things. To take a leap forward in the productivity through new technology. There's kind of two steps to that. One is coming up with the designs, so to speak, coming up with the ideas, the knowledge for how do you make an iPhone or whatever. And the other one is then investing in the capital goods necessary to actually make the iPhones, because you can't make them with the capital goods you had to make the old phones or computers or whatever. Yeah. So you can think of it as two steps, like invent the technology, invest in the necessary capital goods, and then you're ready to go for a while. But then at the same time you're setting off and inventing the next generation. It's like, if you think of the 2G, was it ever called 2G? 3G, 4G, 5G, you know. You've got to invent it, and then you've got to invest in the capital equipment, right? And each time, once you've done those two steps, you've moved up to a higher level of productivity. So that would be the case for the US. But what about China? China has a kind of a simpler problem. Why is that? Have a think about that.
Because the technology is already invented.
The technology is already out there, isn't it? I guess you've done my macro course. But you didn't, right? Or did you? No. Because you've seen this, I think. Probably.
Probably.
So for the US, they're at the frontier. So then they need to invent the technology and then apply it, and Sweden as well. But if it's more China, of course they might be at the frontier in a few areas, but mostly they're not. So the US is up here, China's here. They don't need to do as much inventing. But what do they need to do? They still need to invest in the new technology, and they need to make sure that the people are capable of using it, right? So they need to educate and so on. That's also a form of investment, right? So can you link this to the fact that US, sort of S is about 0.2, and the growth rate is around about 2% per year. As in China, the savings rate is about 0.5, and the growth rate is typically around 10% a year. So the US, is the US growing more slowly because they're not saving as much? Okay. Is the US growing more slowly because they're not saving as much? Have a think about that. Chat to your neighbour. What do you think? What did you guys?
What was the question that you asked?
Yeah. So is the US growing more slowly than China because they're not investing as much?
Eller det är ju inte så att det US bara kan använda så mitt i exempel, alltså det är men från det här tänker jag att det är för att US är högre upp på graden och China kan få mer. Ja,
Och då kan det är lättare att hitta lite grejer när man bara behöver.
I mean, like between two different explanations that they are converging into something of what the Western standard, and that goes pretty was much faster than the growth in the US. But I can't from this I don't know how to
Nej, exakt. Det är svårare att vara högst upp och först.
Ja, medan Kina har varit väldigt säkra där. Om vi investerar så här mycket, då kan vi göra så här många miljoner.
Borde vara.
I suppose that
Eller 5G när kanske.
Ja.
coming up with technology compared to what we can, so that China can basically only do the production.
Okay, so I heard what Elin and Janina were saying, but what did you guys come up with, or what were you?
Like my be like not talking like thinking about that is that it's like it's easier to it's easier to converge to the like say Western standard, like it's easier to catch up, but I don't that doesn't maybe fit in this
Well, it does,
framework
but
of
it's the same.
explanation,
It's
but
yeah, you're not linking it to this, but you can absolutely it has to do with that.
I suppose it has
But
to
can
do
you be
with
more
that.
specific, kind of?
Well, probably that China doesn't need to put any money into research like that.
Right. So I mean, based on this model, if you're down here, basically at these points you've got this better capital installed and running, haven't you? And then here it's even better, and here it's even better, and so on. But if you're at the cutting edge, how do you get to the next level? You can't just buy that better capital. You have to first invent it and then build it. But if you're down here, you can more or less just buy it. Literally, in some cases, production lines from European or the US, European countries or from the US get shipped to China. You know, like we've moved on from this stuff. We're doing things differently. Our labor costs are too high to make a profit using this kind of production technology. But in China, this is like, wow, this is 3 levels better than what we had, these people were using before. So it's just a case of like buying the capital, and then you're off. Assuming that the labor force you might need to educate your labor force. But here, you need to invent the new technology first. But still, you might wonder, why couldn't you invent stuff a lot faster if you saved more? Yeah. Of course, there's a link between how much research you do and the rate of technological progress. But it's not obvious that if you double the amount of research, you're going to double the rate of progress. Because the risk is, among other things, that your extra researchers are going to end up sort of duplicating the discoveries of the ones you've already got. For instance, in production, if you have double the number of workers producing stuff with double the inputs, then you produce double the output. That's great. But in research, if you imagine exactly duplicating 2 labs doing research, and then they come up with, the second lab comes up with exactly the same results as the first lab, it's like, you actually don't have any more production of ideas at all, do you? Because it was the same ideas. This is the special property of ideas compared to things. So it's much tougher to raise the rate of production of new ideas than it is just to buy capital. Okay. So this is like a super fast introduction to some growth theory. And so, if you actually put numbers on this, you can sort of say, well, the US is sort of going up by 1 rung or one loop per period, which might be 20 years, say, if you put some numbers on it. I don't know, I can't remember. Oh, it was 10 years here. But then China would be jumping like 3, 4, 5 rungs per period. But that means this capital here, compared to their GDP, to buy the capital to get up here is really expensive here. Because these machines to get up here are very expensive with their for them, kind of. So that's why it's costly. And of course, there's a lot of nonsense talked about China. It's like, the Chinese economy is in trouble, the growth rate is slackening off. but it's just because they're finally getting, as they get closer to the frontier, it gets trickier to make these. So it's unbelievable. Well, it's amazing it hasn't already happened, but maybe there's signs now that it's starting to happen. They're still nowhere near the frontier, but of course in some sectors they have very good high tech. But in terms of the average quality of capital used by the average Chinese worker, they're way behind still. Okay. So then what we've got left is endogenous growth. Wow. But I guess I've already gone over. So I think we should take a break, right? But then what we're going to talk about with endogenous growth is why in the market, of course in China you can just say, well, what's it called? I was about to say deng. It's not deng anymore, is it? That's an awful long time ago. What's the Chinese boss called? Definitely not Stefan.
Is it Xi Jinping or something like that? It
Xi.
sounds familiar. Xi Jinping.
Qi. Okay, I really don't know actually. But he just sort of he's like almost like the social planner, although he's probably not benevolent. He just tells people what to do. And then he has this terrifying apparatus to make sure it happens. But we're interested in what's driving people's choices to invest in new knowledge in a market economy, and that's what we're trying to do in models of endogenous growth. So we're going to have a bit of a look at that, and after the break, and then we're going to actually go back and wallow in capital for a while, because mainly for historical reasons. I've been convincing you why it's not important to look at capital, but then there's so much research done over the last 45 years which has focused on capital in relation to sustainability and natural resources. So we can't just ignore it. So that will be the rest of the lecture today. Okay, time for a 15-minute break. So the last thing on growth theory, basically, quite important. Why would you actually invest in new ideas? Why would you not invest in new ideas? Give me some thoughts. You know, I'm not wanting polished answers here, but
I guess you would invest in new ideas to get technological growth. Or
okay, but as an individual, so Xi or whatever he's called might do it because he wants, you know, for the great good of China or whatever. But why would an individual want technological growth, kind of, or a firm?
I guess it depends. Did you put?
I did, yeah.
Okay, good. I guess it depends on how risk averse you are, because you would probably expect to get more payoff than investing in something safe. However, you
That's
might lose
absolutely
out.
relevant, but it's kind of at the next level of complication, so to speak.
Maybe too
So
much
risk
of that
aversion is
safe.
super relevant, but it's not. Yeah, I want to get some more basic things nailed down first.
Make your life easier.
Yeah, potentially. So, yeah, so if we take the risk aversion thing, okay, but why is there a payoff at all? You know, okay, but you're saying, oh, the payoff's risky, but then where's the payoff? And then you're saying, okay, it'll make your life easier. So if I'm just at home in my household and I'm in autarky in my home, and I have a little plot where I grow vegetables and so on, I could either sort of get on with growing the vegetables, or I could spend time sort of thinking, how could I do this better? And I might come up with new equipment So that's pretty straightforward. But why, so that situation with everybody in these little autarkies doing research for their own sake is not a very good sort of metaphor for what's really going on. What's the big difference? So there's a massive difference. If I'm sort of growing carrots, and you could think of like me growing carrots for myself and my neighbour growing carrots for himself or herself, or you could think of us sort of pooling resources and growing carrots together. It's not going to make that much difference. But with research it makes a massive difference. You were going to say something.
Synergy? No.
Yeah, not really.
No.
So if I come up with a carrot, what's the difference kind of between me coming up with a carrot and me coming up with a better way of growing carrots?
Because a better way of growing carrots could be adapted by everyone else.
Right. In theory, kind of costlessly. So the value of that could be like kind of infinitely greater than the value of my carrot to society, but not to me, unless I can find a way to make people pay for the right to use my idea. Okay. So if we go back to the original question, then why do firms do research?
Because if you come up with something, the payoff can be really large.
Right. And it's not just like, okay, we can do things a bit cheaper we're producing like 10 widgets a day and now we can produce them a bit more cheaply. So, in the Solo model, for instance, it's kind of gone. But imagine that you have so we've got this kind of situation going on, labour, and there's an infinite number of these firms, in perfect competition. We didn't talk much about that, but that's kind of implicit the whole time in these kind of neoclassical models. It's not that there's literally one firm, there's millions, but they're all doing the same thing. And they're making widgets. But then imagine that one person actually takes some time out and does some research and comes up with a cheaper way of making widgets. Or for the same labor and capital inputs, they can make more widgets per day. And let's imagine that there's some kind of system of intellectual property rights so they can prevent other people using that technology. What's going to happen? Have a think, talk to him. Okay, so it's basically quite straightforward, but a little bit subtle when you get into the details of how it's actually going to work. But you'd think they're going to make an awful lot of money, wouldn't you? How would that actually work? So one way you could think about it would be, well, the individual factory where this person is, say, they can then, with the same labor and capital inputs, they can make more widgets, and then they can sell them. If they just sell them, well, They could just sell them at the same price as everyone else's and make a bit of extra profit because they're still paying the same wages as everyone else. But then you could say, well, maybe they could just pay a tiny bit higher wages and pay a tiny bit more for capital. And then all the people would come and work for them. And all the capital would come, they could hire the capital, the other firms couldn't compete. And they can basically, in the limit, take over the entire market. And all the other firms are going to go bust because no one will want to work for them. Because they're paying like £1 or one crown a year more to hire the capital and labour. And in the model context, everybody's rational and so on. Everybody's going to end up working for this guy, who then has a monopoly over the market, can sell at the monopoly price effectively and make this absolutely immense profit. Okay. So in general, why is this guy? Why would anybody do research?
To get a larger share of the market.
Kind of. I would say to get market power. If you've got something better than other people, then you have market power, and that allows you to get extra profit. And actually you need that to pay for the research. Because the research, when you're doing the research, you're not getting anything for that, are you? So then if in your production verksamhet, in your production operation, thank you, if you're just breaking even there, but you're also spending money on research, you're going to be making a loss, right? So you need the research to give you market power later to then recoup the cost of the research. And potentially in this case, if you're the only one who realizes that it's a good idea to do research, you could recoup a lot more than the cost. But in practice, of course, there's competition here as well to come up with the best new ideas. And you end up in a situation where, on average, the companies are kind of exactly recouping the costs of their research, allowing for risk and so on as well. Okay. And we can model this, one way of modeling this, which isn't the traditional way actually, is to think of a bunch of firms, each making different products. And we can index the firms by I. And the consumers, households, they have a love of variety. So eta there, that's the Greek letter, that's an eta. If that is equal to 1, then y is, you just add up the quantities of the different products. And then there's no love of variety. They're perfect substitutes, the different products. But if eta is less than 1, then there's a love of variety. That the households have a preference for about the same quantity of each good rather than lots of one and little of another. Okay. If you took the first order condition here, you would see that the marginal product of any particular one of those will be much higher it's higher if it's low, if the quantity of it is low. Okay, so this gives eta less than 1, gives the consumers a level of variety. And that gives each of these producers some market power. Okay, because they've each got this unique product. Then to maintain that, they're going to need to invest, or they have the option to invest. Okay. So I guess I did a video for this, right? Yeah. And I didn't go through the math. I started doing a video going through the math, and then I just what I want you to do is get some of the intuition. Okay.
But it feels like a pretty decent, what do you say, like depiction of how reality works. Like that's.
Yeah. This is, I'm trying to capture that in this. So I basically came up with this model. That we've got different firms with different products. And the consumers want a balance of the products. And then each firm has a certain degree of market power, but not much. Because the preference for the love of variety isn't all that strong. But it means that effectively the stronger is the love of variety, the stronger are the incentives to do research. Because the bigger the market power you're going to have if you have a better product. Okay, what more is there to say on this? Yeah, I think I'm going to leave you with the video actually, to be honest. I don't think I want to say too much more about this. Just to emphasize again that what we're doing is endogenizing the how much effort, labor in this case, does each firm I put into trying to improve its productivity. And it's basically linked to the market power that the firm can get by increasing its productivity. I don't know if I really want to say anything more. Any questions about that? Yeah, I think we'll park endogenous growth there. Okay. Yeah, we're going to come back to this to some extent when we're looking at the direction of investment. Do you invest in having more efficient labor or more efficient resource use? So that's will be quite important. Here we've only got labor. We've only got labor in the production function. But if you had labor and resources, then you could potentially invest in AL, which would mean you'd need to hire less labor if you boost AL. Or you could have AR rising, and then you need to buy fewer resources. And we're going to look later at that sort of dilemma and how that pans out. And to analyze that, you need a sort of full endogenous growth model. But we're not going to go through the full model, we're just going to look at the specific aspects to do with the direction. Okay, so that is growth theory. Solow and Ramsey, a quick look at vintage growth models, and then a very quick look at endogenous growth. Solow and Ramsey focus on capital and show that capital isn't the key to growth. It's labor productivity, but we don't know why labor productivity grows. The vintage models, you're combining kind of both and saying, yeah, of course, we need new capital to go with the new technology. And here we shift the focus totally to the technological progress and why firms and individuals choose to do research. Okay. So any questions about growth, basically, before we go on to, I can't remember what the next lot of slides is called, but it's the DHSS model anyway. So we're going on to environment and resources, basically. Should we go on? Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to stop this video.